Everything you see here could not look more different, and yet all of them are related to each other. The evidence of evolution suggests that all life started from a single cell and developed into more than 1.8 million species that exist today, and the millions of species that existed in the past. For centuries, people thought that fungi and plants were closely related, which makes sense. They both grow out of the ground and they just sit there. But with further molecular techniques and studying the anatomy and physiology, fungi are actually, believe it or not, more closely related to animals. And this kind of weird is all thanks to the hard-working biologists who worked to map out how a single-celled common ancestor evolved into the most beautiful tapestry of life we see today. Since all life evolved from a single common ancestor, biologists map out phylogenetic trees to help show the interrelationship between major groups. This is often called the tree of life, where the single common ancestor is the trunk and each subsequent descendant group branches off into their own descendant groups. Notice how the star represents where you are located, but if you zoom into the animal group, you will see it is still heavily branched with the various groups of animals that exist. At the most basic grouping, all life can fit into one of three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea diverged early on in history, and eukarya came later. After that, each of the groups further divided into the major subgroups that we see today. Members of the same branch are more closely related to each other than those in more distant branches. Phylogeny is the focus of this chapter and is the evolutionary history and relationships of an organism or group of organisms. Systematics is the organization and classification of organisms based on evolutionary relationships. Data, such as the fossil record, comparative anatomy, biochemistry of each species, and the sequencing of DNA and amino acids are all used to help classify organisms into groups. While systematics helps to arrange organismal groups by evolutionary relatedness, taxonomy helps to construct a classification system where each organism is placed into increasingly more inclusive groupings. We use classification schemes in our lives all the time. Take movies. We classify them into genres of film such as horror, action, adventure, romance, comedy, drama, etc. And we all know the characteristics of horror movies. They're scary, messes with your head, gore, disturbance. Even amongst horror movies, there are subgenres that exist. Thrillers, which focus more on panic and loss of control. Gore focuses on murder and extreme violence, and ghost movies feature ghosts.
Seriously?
Regardless, we know that these classification schemes, based on characteristics of genres and subgenres, we do the same thing with organisms, only we get even more in depth. To see how specific taxonomy gets, let's use the taxonomy of a green anole. Its species name is Anolis caroliniensis. However, using the classification scheme in biology, we can start with the most inclusive taxon to the most exclusive. First, green anoles are in domain eukarya, which consists of all organisms with eukaryotic cells. Which type of eukaryote are green anoles? They are animals, which is their kingdom. All animals are multicellular, move, and have internal digestion. The flower displayed is a plant and is excluded from this kingdom. What kind of animal are green anoles? They're in Phylum Chordata. And these are animals that have a major nerve cord along the back, tails, and gill slits at some point during their embryonic development. The insect seen is an arthropod, which does not have any of these characteristics and is in a separate phylum. So what kind of chordate is a green anole? Well, they're in class Reptilia, which have external scales and lay eggs. The pelican is a bird, which is not included since they have feathers and a beak. What kind of reptile is a green anole? Well, they're in order Squamata, and these are the lizards and snakes. The American alligator is not included because it is a crocodilian. What kind of lizard is a green anole? It is in family Dactyloidae, known as the anole family. And members of this family have a colorful dewlap used to attract mates and signify territoriality to other males. Wouldn't that be weird if this was considered sexy in humans?
No.
What kind of green anole is the green anole? It is a genus Anolis. There are other genera in the anole family, but this one is the most common. Finally, the green anole is in species Anolis caroliniensis. There's another anole on display here called a brown anole, which is called Anolis sagrii. And you may notice that each species has their own scientific name. This was first proposed by Swedish biologist Carl von Linné, which used what's called binomial nomenclature. That is, every species has a genus and species name, and that name is in Latin, which we use because Latin is a dead language, is not subject to changes, unlike my language, English. Ugh. The rules of binomial nomenclature are simple, and I'll use a Fraser fir as an example. The genus is capitalized and the species is lowercase. When typing the name, write it in italics. If handwriting the name, underline it. So in the case of Fraser fir, the scientific name is Abies fraseri, and here are a few more organisms and their scientific names. Bison, Juniperus virginiana, Amoeba proteus, Streptococcus epidermidis, Canis familiaris, and our own species, Homo sapiens. Okay, so why use scientific names? What's wrong with just calling an organism the name that we were taught? Nothing. But scientific names assign one name to one species and it accurately shows evolutionary relationships. Here is a western cougar, Puma concolor. There are other names for this organism: mountain lion, puma, gorgeous older woman, Florida panther, and others. Puma concolor is only assigned to this species and no other cat. Here's a crawdad, at least that's what I call it, but others may call it a crayfish, crawfish, mudbug, or creek lobster. It is a crustacean that lives in fresh water, and it is not a bug, fish, lobster. But it may be a dad, and if you lived around the year 2015, it can be cray. The point is, using scientific names cuts to confusion when speaking with other scientists worldwide who may have their own cultural names for the same species. Common names can also be quite misleading. Prairie dogs are not dogs, guinea pigs are not pigs, nor are they from Guinea. Koala bears are not bears, and sea cucumber is not a cucumber, not even a plant, but an animal related to sea stars. And yes, sea stars are not fish. So starfish is misleading too. Since the diversity of life is so vast, it can be overwhelming to solve the relatedness between the species. Scientists use phylogenetic trees to depict visually the relatedness between groups of organisms. Phylogenetic trees serve as hypotheses of our evolutionary past, as it is impossible to confirm these relationships since we can't go back in time. There are two types of phylogenetic trees: rooted trees, which show a single ancestral lineage depicted by a single trunk on the bottom of the left image, and unrooted trees don't show ancestry, but they do depict relatedness. When viewing rooted trees, the goal is to determine common ancestry. It begins with a branch point, which indicates where a single lineage evolved into a new one. If it remains unbranched, we call this a basal taxon. Sister taxa represent two lineages stemming from the same branch point, and polytomy represents three or more lineages stemming from the same branch point. Important point: though members of polytomy share ancestry, they do not evolve from one another. We share a polytomic branch with gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, and bonobos, but we did not evolve from them, nor did they evolve from us. Human-like primates diverged from the other great apes around 6 to 7 million years ago. Data is used to help build phylogenetic trees, which comes from fossils traditionally, but the use of molecular techniques such as DNA analysis between species has further supported relatedness between species. However, there are limitations to phylogenetic trees. First, branches, unless labeled as such, do not depict the amount of time that has passed, only the evolutionary order of a grouping. Second, many assume that two organisms that look alike are more related. However, that is not always the case. Rabbits and lizards are more related to each other than lizards and salamanders, based on the fact that both produce amniotic eggs, which is an egg that has a protective coating over the embryo,
even though salamanders and lizards superficially look alike.
Third, it is possible for more ancestral species to continue to exist and evolve alongside more descendant species. For example, lancelets did not evolve a vertebral column, but that doesn't mean they stopped evolving. They just simply formed a new evolutionary branch. The other issue is convergent evolution, and this occurs when two organisms evolve similar features, not due to sharing ancestry, but due to environmental pressures. Succulent plants, which are those with thick leaves and stems for water storage and may contain spines, are quite diverse, and many are distantly related to each other. The only reason they evolved these adaptations was due to living in dry climates, not because they share common ancestry. And as you can see, organizing life on Earth is not easy. And although scientists agree that evolution by natural selection is the means by which organisms change over time, they often get into really nerdy debates about the intricacies of phylogenetic trees based on emerging data. As more fossil evidence and DNA evidence develops, species and groups of species can be rearranged to fit the new data. In our next video, we will see how evolutionary relationships are determined between different groups of organisms.